I'm Teresa.
And I'm Callista, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime. So, as is our custom, we thought we'd start off by talking about a show we're enjoying called A Spy Among Friends, which is on Amazon Prime in the US. And one of our favorite podcasts, British Scandal, actually did a series on it. I think it was called The Cambridge Spy Ring. But the show version has Damian Lewis, who is, of course, excellent, as always. See Homeland.
Yeah, and it's funny. I started listening because it's been so long since I listened to the series on British Scandal just a little bit again and everything. I mean, to plug another podcast that does something completely different than true crime, they're just great. I just love everything they do. But it's interesting. And then I also went down because I apparently like to do that down like, a Google rabbit hole with, all the variations, TV shows, movies, and stuff based on the case. But it's just really interesting. And of course, Damian Lewis and then Guy Pearce, which I don't think you've seen him in a lot. I remember him from like LA Confidential, like mid 90s. They're showing my age. Um, but it's just, I mean, I think it was originally on BritBox, which again, let's plug BritBox. Love, love pretty much everything we've tried.
Mhm.
It's just done really well. It's just really interesting. It's historical, but it's not like historical, like in a boring way. It's just, yeah, I get a kick out of it.
Yeah, definitely. Didn't it come out a few years ago in the UK?
Yeah, I think it came out in 2022.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, it's really done well. Obviously, it's been well researched. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that, I know all the ins and outs of the story, but based on what I remember from British Scandal, I think it's sticking to the facts pretty well. And then obviously, they dramatized it, added, some female characters, which didn't really star besides his wives and like, I think the actual account. And so I'm enjoying that. And I just think all the actors are doing well. Would definitely recommend.
Yeah, definitely. I like the female character that they've added, of course, because look, being, her position in that period of time, I thought maybe it's not based in reality, obviously, that part, but I enjoyed that. And also, though, I think Cambridge Spy, the British Scandal one, I don't think they mention very much Damien's role in it. I think it's more, because he's kind of on the outside and, he not to give it away, he lets him go, doesn't let him go kind of thing.
I think they mention Nick more in the very last episode. I think
They talk about the others that were involved. I think it's the Cambridge 5 spy ring. I think there's 5 of them. But anyways, yeah, it's done really well. So, yeah, we're
yeah.
liking it. All right. I was just going to say, you mentioned Homeland for Damian Lewis, which of course he is excellent in. I feel like he's not in that one enough. But Billions also, totally different kind of, think, character for him in Billions. But he's really good in that too. The show kind of went off the deep end when he left before the last season.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, wouldn't really say it's worth it to continue watching after he leaves. He kind of made it.
Yeah, he really did make it. Alrighty, well, on to the episode. We're continuing with our theme on serial killers who targeted gay men in the 90s with Gary Ray Bowles. And just a note for this episode, since it is set in the 1990s, there is some outdated language when we get to the eventual trial. We've chosen to leave that in because it is the wording used in the official court proceedings. On November 19th, 1994, Gary became the 438th person added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Thankfully, his spot on the infamous list only lasted 3 days, as he was arrested in Jacksonville Beach, Florida on November 22nd at an employment office for day laborers. And just to stop for a sec, I get that my voice sounds a little weird. I've been fighting a cold, so sorry about that. I will try not to hack or have some kind of disruption during the episode, but if it sounds a little off, that's why.
Well, you sound a lot better than you did. Thank God you're feeling better now.
There you go. There you go. Gary was able to evade police for 8 long months because rather than staying in one place and committing his crimes in one geographical area, he used the expansive Interstate 95 as his hunting grounds, which would lead the media to refer to him as the I-95 killer. Gary was also a fan of using aliases to hide his identity and assumed various police departments would not link his crimes. This was also 1994, and though centralized computer databases existed, tying cases together still required vigilant investigators. The murder, which would be Gary's last and the one that led to his arrest, was that of 42-year-old Walter J. Hinton.
Jay was a kind hearted florist living in Jacksonville, Florida, when he crossed paths with Gary. On a warm October day in 1994, Jay was enjoying the beach with some of his friends when he mentioned that he really needed to find someone to help him with things around his house. One of his friends mentioned that he had been a man named Tim who was new to town and was looking for work and a place to stay. And as luck would have it, Gary slash Tim was on the beach that day. Jay approached the dark haired drifter and offered him a place to stay if he would help with moving some items from Georgia to Jacksonville, along with doing some cleanup around his house. Unfortunately, with no good deed left unpunished, this friendly gesture would lead to Jay's brutal murder. On November 16th, Gary rode with Jay as he took his friend Richard Smith to the train station. Gary and Richard had been drinking and smoking weed most of the day, with Gary continuing to drink beer while on the way to and back from the train station. When Gary and Jay arrived back at Jay's home, Jay confronted Gary about not doing the things he was supposed to do to live rent-free at Jay's place. Gary was obviously drunk, and Jay, exhausted, said they could talk more the next day and went to bed. Gary stayed up drinking and fuming. He went outside and picked up one of the concrete stepping stones leading to Jay's door, brought it inside, and set it on the kitchen table. He smoked a few of his favorite Cool brand cigarettes, getting angrier and angrier about Jay telling him what to do. He picked up the stepping stone, walked into Jay's darkened room, stood above Jay's sleeping body, and dropped the 40-pound piece of concrete on Jay's head.
Though the trauma was catastrophic and blood immediately began flowing from the injury on the left side of his head, Jay didn't die instantly. He was startled and scared out of his mind and fell out of bed. Gary climbed on top of Jay and manually strangled him until he stopped moving. He then dragged Jay's body into the bathroom, where he stuffed an empty toilet paper roll and a rag into his mouth. He went through his pockets, then covered his body with towels and blankets from the bed, finally closing the bedroom door. Gary stayed in Jay's home, watching his TV, eating his food, drinking his alcohol, before taking the cash and credit cards from Jay's wallet, along with his car, and leaving Florida. Jay's sister Belinda celebrated her birthday on November 18th and was surprised when she didn't hear from him. She had talked to him a few days earlier, and Jay never forgot her birthday. She tried calling him that night but didn't get an answer. She was a little concerned but didn't think too much of it. However, when she called the next day and still got no response, she and her fiancé William drove to Jay's trailer. They knocked on the door and peered through the windows that they could reach, but nothing seemed amiss. Lights were on, but Jay's Cadillac was gone, so maybe he was just running errands or out with friends. Belinda and William returned home, but Belinda couldn't shake the niggling feeling that something was wrong. She called again several times, but couldn't reach Jay. She barely slept at all that night. The next morning, Belinda called Jay's work and found out that he had missed the last 2 days of work and hadn't called in. This was out of character. Jay was responsible and wouldn't blow off work without calling in. So she and William headed back to Jay's home. The Cadillac was still gone and the same lights were on.
This time, William was sure something was wrong. He was able to reach a back window and used a large rock to shatter the glass. William told Belinda to stay in the yard as he climbed through the window. William was immediately met with a foul odor. He walked through the compact space, calling Jay's name as he moved through the home. He stopped in front of his soon-to-be brother-in-law's bedroom, opened the door, and saw that the room was in disarray. Blankets were pulled off the bed, a lamp was on the floor, and dark rust-colored patches were on the carpet. William walked towards Jay's bathroom and found a large mound on the floor covered in towels and blankets and what looked like blood on the floor. He lifted a corner of the blankets and saw the bloodied, decomposing body of Jay. He quickly left the trailer and relayed the horrific news to Belinda that her brother was dead. A nearby neighbor called the police. Police and forensics combed the small home for evidence. They noted that Jay's wallet, watch, and car were gone, and his pockets had been turned inside out. It was obvious that a struggle had taken place in Jay's bedroom. The rest of the trailer was messy, strewn with empty beer cans and small liquor bottles. Police found a receipt with the name of Timothy Westfield. Investigators interviewed friends and family of Jay's and were informed that a drifter named Tim had been staying with him. A sketch artist drew a composite sketch of Jay's house guest, and investigators began searching for Tim. A tip was called in that Tim had been working with the AmeriForce staffing agency. Investigators called AmeriForce to verify Tim's employment and find out when he was scheduled to work again. On November 22nd, 1994, police arrested Tim/Gary when he showed up to work.
Investigator Joe Collins, lead detective on the case, conducted the initial interview with Tim. Joe continually tried to push Tim's buttons to get a reaction, or at least more than the half-truths that Tim was spewing. Tim was getting frustrated and agitated, and no longer wanting to play the investigator's game, jumped up from his chair and said, "Do you want to know who I really am? I'm Gary Ray Bowles, and I'm a wanted man." I'm sorry, it sounds like a bad movie.
Yeah, that's not the flex you think it is, Gary.
Yeah, too true, though serial killers seem to be a narcissistic lot.
That they are.
Gary pulled out his wallet where he had his real ID showing his driver's license to the detective. He told the investigators details about Jay's murder, but also confessed to the murders of Floridians John Roberts and Albert Morris. News of the arrest made the national news, and detectives from other precincts began calling, believing that victims in their jurisdictions may have been murdered by Gary. Gary would eventually confess to the murders of 6 men. When asked why he confessed, he said, "So the killing would stop. I didn't want to kill nobody, but I did. I don't know why." Additionally, when asked why he always stuffed something into the mouths of his victims, he said it was so if they woke up, they wouldn't be able to breathe. He wanted to make sure they were dead.
And what? He hoped they'd be too badly injured or disoriented to remove it if they did wake up?
Yeah, I call bullshit on his explanation. I think it was just another power move.
Yeah, I agree.
Predictably, Gary's childhood was fraught with turmoil. Born on January 25th, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia, to William Franklin and Frances Carroll Price Bowles, Gary's father died before he was born. William was a coal miner and died of the particularly horrific black lung disease, which afflicts coal miners after years of breathing in noxious coal dust.
Which I'm sure the companies they worked for could have predicted, but of course, they just didn't care.
I mean, workers' rights are shit today, so I can't even imagine what it was like back then. You really are just a cog in the machine.
No question.
Gary, along with his older brother, were raised by his mother and various stepfathers. Gary's first stepfather was abusive to him and his brother. Francis would later testify in court that the boys were physically abused by this piece of shit human with both his fists and a belt. And when she tried to step in and protect them, she would become the target of the abuse. Francis did divorce stepfather one, but did not choose wisely and married another abuser. Stepfather 2 was a raging alcoholic, and fueled by his poison of choice, he would beat Francis, Gary, and his brother. Francis was hospitalized several times due to these severe beatings. Since this was the 1970s and domestic violence wasn't even deemed illegal until 1994, let me say that again. Domestic violence was not illegal until Congress enacted the Violence Against Women Act.
Gotta love that it was a husband's prerogative to beat his wife black and blue.
I mean, they gotta show him who's boss. I actually feel my blood boiling.
It's beyond rage inducing. This shit childhood, controlled by abusive men, led 10-year-old Gary, in an attempt to escape his miserable situation, to experiment with sniffing paint and glue, and he dropped out of school in the 8th grade. The violence in the home did not abate, and Gary and his brother became increasingly frustrated and angry with their living situation. When Gary was 14, he and his brother overwhelmed their stepfather and severely beat him with a rock. But he survived. Gary, disgusted by his mother's refusal to leave the marriage, left home shortly after the beating. Gary was homeless and turned to stealing and panhandling to survive. One predator, who picked up Gary while he was hitchhiking, told him he could make money by performing sex work with men. Gary would later say that he wasn't gay and would not perform sexual acts on men, but would allow them to perform oral sex on him. He considered himself a hustler, using these men to get what he wanted. He drifted around the country, living in Illinois, Missouri, Louisiana, and, most notably, Florida. He was arrested at 17 on a marijuana charge, but his first brush with the consequences of his actions was on September 27th, 1982, in Tampa, Florida, when he was convicted of sexual battery and aggravated sexual battery against his then girlfriend.
Gary violently and brutally attacked her, causing contusions on her head, face, neck, and chest, in addition to bites to her breasts. She also had fingerprint bruising on her neck from Gary's attempt to strangle her. Her eyes were swollen shut, and she horrifically suffered internal injuries, including lacerations to her vagina and rectum.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's barbaric.
Yeah.
The police detective who worked on the case said that he had never seen a case so bad and that the injuries were the work of a sadist. For this horrendous crime, Gary was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but because violence against women does not receive the harsh punishment it should, he was released after 3.
It's not surprising, but still, what the actual fuck?
Yeah, I know. It really is a slap on the wrist.
Uh-huh.
After his release in the summer of 1991, Gary pushed a woman down and stole her purse. He was convicted of unarmed robbery on July 18th, 1991, and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was paroled in December of 1993. On his release, he moved to Daytona Beach and quickly moved in with a woman he had only recently met and resumed sex work to support himself. His girlfriend became pregnant, but purportedly had an abortion when she realized what Gary did for work. This led to the end of their relationship. Gary, with not even his pinky finger in the world of reality, absurdly blamed gay men for the abortion and said this led to his murderous rampage.
Because that makes complete sense.
I mean, he obviously needed to place the blame somewhere.
Obviously. Gary's first murder victim was John Hardy Roberts, a 59-year-old openly gay insurance salesman. Gary met John at a local gay bar in Daytona Beach, Florida, and turning on his false charm, he wormed his way into John's life and his home. The situation was amicable, at least for a few weeks, until on March 15th, John heard Gary talking on the phone with a woman and became jealous. John told his house guest that while he was living with him, he couldn't engage in other romantic relationships, which seems fair enough. This infuriated Gary, and with his rage boiling over, he grabbed a glass table lamp and repeatedly beat John over the head with it. John attempted to get away, but in his haste, fell into a coffee table. Gary climbed on top of John and strangled him to death. Then, in a move that he would continue to execute in his future crimes, he grabbed a rag and stuffed it into John's mouth. Gary turned out John's pockets, stole his wallet and his car, and hurriedly left the home. A friend of John's, who hadn't heard from him in a few days, called the police department for a wellness check. Police found John's house ransacked, and John's beaten and bloody body on his living room floor. He had been beaten and strangled, and a bloody rag had been stuffed into his mouth so violently that his larynx had been damaged. There were signs of trauma all over his body. One of his fingers was so damaged that it was almost severed. When investigators began talking to John's friends, they all mentioned that he had recently met a man at a gay bar and allowed him to move in. Investigators found a lot of evidence pointing to the murderer. Gary, in his quick exit of the home, had left his probation paperwork with his name and case number behind. Police were able to look up Gary's criminal history, which was littered with assaults and burglaries, along with several booking photos. Detective Allison Sylvester said, "That was a nice calling card that he left with his name on it. That was helpful." A day after John's body was found, police obtained surveillance footage from an ATM that captured an image of a smiling Gary attempting to use John's bank card. He failed to extract any cash from the machine, but did make use of John's credit cards and car.
A couple days after the news broke about John's murder, the Daytona Beach News Journal published Gary's name as a person of interest, but he was no longer in Florida. Gary had headed north, purchasing gas and food at various convenience stores with the stolen credit card before dumping the car near Nashville, Tennessee. Unfortunately, that's where police lost track of him, but not for long. They picked up his trail again, this time in the Washington, D.C. area. Using the supposed charm and easygoing demeanor, Gary was able to convince a few young men he had met at a local bar to give him a place to crash temporarily. They did, but only for a few days. On April 14th, in suburban Maryland, a maintenance man found the decomposing body of 38-year-old David Jarman in the basement of his Silver Springs home. David had been badly beaten and strangled to death, with a sex toy stuffed into his throat. His pockets were emptied and his wallet and car were missing. According to friends of David's, the last time he was seen was outside of a gay bar in Washington, D.C.'s historical DuPont Circle area with an unknown man who matched Gary's description. One of David's credit cards was used to book a motel in nearby Baltimore. Gary remained one step ahead of law enforcement. On one hand, he was sloppy, leaving paperwork with his name at a crime scene, but on the other, he had been a drifter since his teens and was able to hide in plain sight.
After David's murder, Gary decided to head back south, this time stopping in Savannah, Georgia. Several weeks after David's death, Gary's third victim would be found. On May 5th, a worker at a Savannah golf course was checking the grounds, heading towards the maintenance shed. As she neared the shed, she noticed something on the ground but wasn't sure what it was until she got closer and realized she was looking at a dead body. Police were called and immediately noted that a violent struggle had taken place. The victim, an older man, had visible trauma to his body. His pants pockets had been turned inside out, and his mouth was stuffed with small twigs, dirt, and leaves. An autopsy would determine that the victim had been savagely beaten before being strangled to the point of bones in his neck being broken. This was a rage-filled killing with an excessive amount of force used. An old toilet seat covered with blood laid near the body. The victim was 72-year-old World War II veteran Milton Bradley. The murder shocked the close-knit community. Milton was a genteel elderly man who was friendly to everyone and liked to keep close to downtown Savannah where locals looked out for him. Milton had suffered a severe head injury in the war, which resulted in a later lobotomy. The barbaric procedure caused a slight mental impairment, which may have made him more vulnerable to the likes of someone like Gary, who preyed on those he viewed as weaker than him. Detective John Best noted that a clear palm print had been left at the scene. Investigators would learn that Milton had been seen leaving a bar with a younger man who seemed to be flirting with him. Patrons mentioned that the younger man returned to the bar about 30 minutes after leaving, but this time he was alone. Various witnesses said that Gary had come on to them and that he had creeped them out. Detective Best would echo what other detectives investigating the various crime scenes would say. It was extremely violent and it was overkill.
Days after Milton's body was found, several hours from Savannah in Atlanta, Georgia, Gary met 47-year-old Alberson Carter Jr. at a local gay bar. Alverson invited Gary back to his apartment where the drinking continued. Gary, though he had initially agreed to trade sex for money, became agitated when Alverson initiated sex. Gary left the bedroom saying he needed another drink. Once in the kitchen, Gary opened drawers until he found a butcher knife. He took the knife, returned to the bedroom, and stabbed Alverson to death. After Alverson was dead, he grabbed a hand towel from the bathroom and stuffed it down his throat. As was his norm, he turned out his pockets, stole his wallet, and his car. Alverson's body would be found 2 days later on May 13th. Gary drove further south back to Florida, this time to Hilliard. A worker from the convenience store that the Morris family owned called the owners asking if they had heard from their 37-year-old son, Albert. Albert hadn't shown up for work and he wasn't answering his phone. Albert's parents thanked the employee for calling and said they would go to his house and check on him. When they arrived at their son's mobile home, they noticed a bloody handprint on the front door.
His poor parents. That's straight out of a horror movie.
It really is. Frantically knocking and calling out Albert's name, when they received no response, they were sure something was wrong and broke into the trailer. There, in the living room, was Albert's bloodied body. Albert had severe trauma to his face, blood around his head, and a gunshot to his chest. A kitchen towel had been stuffed into his mouth. His pockets had been rifled through, and his wallet and car were missing. A bloodied marble ashtray was found discarded near the body. There was also a clear palm print on the TV entertainment center. Investigators spoke to people close to Albert and learned that he frequented local gay bars and had recently befriended a man named Joey Pearson. Albert's friend Jackie said Albert allowed Joey to move in because he had promised to complete some odd jobs around his property. However, this was an empty promise, and Albert was getting frustrated with Joey. Police searched for Joey Pearson, but soon realized this was an alias.
Nassau County Police reached out to the Savannah Police Department, who had circulated Gary's sketch nationwide. Police posted the sketch around Nassau County and were contacted by a witness who said he thought he knew who they were looking for. The witness mentioned that he had hung out with the man at a local convenience store, the store that Albert worked at. Police were able to view security cameras and actually found footage of their suspect. Police showed the footage to Albert's friend Jackie, and he confirmed that the video still was of Joey. In a scenario which doesn't often happen, the police departments worked together to find their killer. The FBI also became involved when it became clear that they were looking for a serial killer who drifted from one place to another and used multiple aliases. Authorities sent out a bulletin with Gary's description and information that he targeted men at gay bars, befriended them, moved in, murdered them, and then stole what he could before he moved on to his next target, 2 other police departments, to see if there had been any similar murders. It is believed that Gary propositioned himself to Albert at a bar in Jacksonville. Shortly after their meeting, Albert invited Gary to stay with him in his trailer. The night before Albert's body was found, witnesses recall seeing Albert and another man matching Gary's description arguing outside of a bar. Based on the evidence found at the crime scene, Gary was charged with murder, but no one knew where he was.
Gary also found his next alias at the trailer. After the murder, while pilfering through Albert's belongings, he found a birth certificate and other paperwork belonging to a Timothy Whitfield. Albert's relationship with Tim was unclear, as was the fact that important documents were in his home. Armed with the birth certificate, Gary was able to obtain a driver's license and social security card in Tim's name. During Gary's time impersonating Tim, he was arrested for several misdemeanors, which he served as Tim. Really leaning into his new identity, he even spent 5 days in jail for a crime committed by the real Tim. He didn't want to blow his cover, so he quietly served the time.
Which shows a certain level of commitment, but even Gary could see it was a better option than serving years for murder.
Yeah. Amazingly, during this time, police never figured out that Tim was really Gary, even though he had been featured on a national crime show along with stories in Newsweek and USA Today.
I can understand not recognizing him by sight, but surely they took his fingerprints before admitting him, right?
I mean, I'm sure that that was the procedure, but did someone forget to verify them with what they had on file? I mean, maybe it was a busy day at the precinct.
Apparently so.
In July 1994, Gary was profiled on America's Most Wanted. His eagle eyed former housemates saw the episode and contacted police. Police questioned Gary, but because he was now tan and sporting a mustache, and they bought whatever bullshit story Gary told them, they decided Gary didn't match the police sketch.
Oh my god, that was the extent of his disguise and it worked? Come on.
I mean, we are talking A level policing here.
We really are.
They neglected to verify any identifying marks, including tattoos and several knife scars. Gary was eventually charged with the murder of Milton, yet he remained several steps ahead of the FBI and state authorities. After murdering Albert, Gary laid low in Florida until October when he befriended Jay Hinton. Since the killings had stopped for months, the media attention waned. That was until Gary was listed on the FBI's most wanted list. Maybe knowing his days of freedom were coming to an end, he killed one more time, 2 days after making the notorious list and having his picture plastered across the nightly news.
When Albert's body was discovered with the same MO as the other murders, forensic evidence linked Gary to the crime and investigators determined that he was Gary's fifth victim. Gary wasn't initially charged with any of the additional murders beyond John's and Milton's until he was arrested for the murder of Jay Hinton. But Gary eventually confessed to the murders of all 6 men after extensive interrogations by the FBI and authorities in several states. He volunteered that he met most of his victims in gay bars and offered them sex in return for money and a place to stay. Eventually, growing tired of the situation, Gary would murder the men, often strangling and or bludgeoning them. He would then steal any cash he could find along with their credit cards, not making much of an effort to cover his tracks. The grand jury indicted Gary on December 8, 1994, on charges of first-degree murder of Jay Hinton and robbery. Gary pled guilty to both charges. Sentencing was held in Duval County, Florida, with Judge Jack Schemer presiding. Assistant State Attorney Bernardo de la Rionda argued that Jay's murder was motivated by financial gain and that the murder was sexually motivated and aggravated by his hatred of gay men. The public defenders assigned to the case, attorneys William White and Charles Kofer, argued that Gary suffered from mental instability at the time of the murder, along with mental impairment as a result of the physical abuse he sustained as a child, with alcohol and marijuana use as contributing factors. Contradicting the state, they argued that the murder was not sexually motivated and was not carried out for financial gain.
Gary was convicted on October 10, 1996. The jury found Gary guilty on both charges and recommended 10-2 that he should receive the death penalty. Gary was initially sentenced to death, but his attorneys immediately filed a direct appeal with the Supreme Court of Florida. More than half a dozen issues were argued in the appeal, one of which cited that the state failed to supply evidence proving that the murder was homosexually motivated. The Supreme Court of Florida found that there was no causal connection between Gary's alleged hatred for homosexuals and Jay's murder. They affirmed the conviction but overturned the death sentence, finding that the trial court erred in allowing the state to introduce evidence of Gary's alleged hatred of homosexual men. They remanded the case to the state circuit court for new sentencing. Once again, Judge Jack Schemer presided over the proceedings. During the resentencing trial, some of Gary's prior felonies were included in the state's case. The felonies included his convictions for sexual battery, robbery, and the first-degree murders of John Roberts and Albert Morris, to which he had previously pled guilty and been given life sentences. Following intense arguments from both the prosecution and defense teams, on May 27, 1999, the jury returned its verdict after only 1 hour of deliberation. They unanimously found Gary guilty and again recommended that he be sentenced to death in the electric chair.
Gary's attorneys again filed an appeal with the Florida Supreme Court. This time, 12 issues were raised. Among the issues, they claimed that the court erred in allowing the state to introduce John's and Albert's murder convictions because they were not in the original sentencing proceedings. Moreover, they also argued that the court erred in its finding that the murder was committed in the course of robbery for financial gain. On October 11th, 2001, the Supreme Court of Florida ruled in favor of the circuit court. They were able to find no errors during the resentencing procedure, thus supporting the recommendation for the death sentence. Frustrated by the decision, Gary's lawyers then filed another petition, this time to the United States Supreme Court. However, the petition was denied in June 2002. Gary spent 20 years on Florida's death row. During his time on death row, the default method of execution in Florida changed from the electric chair to lethal injection. Inmates can actually still choose the electric chair if they so desire, at least in Florida. Gary was executed by lethal injection on August 22nd, 2019, in Stark, Florida. He was 57 years old. He was the 99th inmate to be put to death in Florida since 1976, when the death penalty was restored by the Supreme Court. No family members of Gary's victims witnessed the execution. Instead, the witnesses were mostly comprised of retired law enforcement officers. Among them was Bernardo de la Rionda, who said, "That's a very sad and unfortunate part of this, how long it took for this day to happen."
I get he is a prosecutor, and I'm honestly torn on the death penalty, but that seems like an odd comment. That's how our system is. People spend years on death row. It takes years for all their appeals to be exhausted, and I would rather it take years for an inmate to be executed rather than rushing it through.
Yeah, I can understand the desire to fast track the execution if, for example, a victim's loved one doesn't have long left. But even if I wasn't against the death penalty, I don't think I'd support expediting the process at the risk of sacrificing due process.
Good point.
Attorney De La Rionda said that he has obtained death sentences for more than 30 murder defendants. Gary was only the second one that he witnessed, though he intends to be present for all of them, saying that that is a promise he makes to each victim's family. Gary penned a letter to be read to reporters after his death. He apologized for all the pain and suffering I've caused. He also apologized to his mother. Having to deal with your son being called a monster is terrible. I'm so very sorry. I never wanted this to be my life. You don't wake up one day and decide to become a serial killer.
I mean, I'm sure that's true, but it's not a wand. The serial killer life didn't choose you.
Nice Harry Potter reference. And if he was really sorry, he'd offer more than a blanket apology to the friends and families of the 6 men he brutally murdered.
Right?
One member of law enforcement who declined to attend the execution was retired Savannah Police Department Detective Best. Though he believed that the death sentence was just, he was taken aback by the tone of Gary's letter, saying he was surprised that he expressed regret for what he had done and seemed to be sincere.
I mean, that's magnanimous of him.
I'd say so.
Gary was interviewed for an episode of the Killer Speaks series, which we did not watch. Just doesn't seem like our kind of thing. Anywho, an article regarding the episode said that he showed little remorse, though I assume being interviewed for a TV show and writing a letter before your execution are two very different things.
True, and the years that passed between the show and his death likely made a difference too.
Definitely. Next time, we'll be continuing our series on serial killers who targeted gay men in the 90s when we discuss the case of Richard Rogers.
All the sources we used for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, you can email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast on Instagram and at terrifyinglytypicalpod on TikTok. Feel free to leave us a comment, rating, or review to let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next time.